Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by mental health guru and author, Brian Sachetta. Brian is the author of the Get Out of Your Head book series. This series is a collection of personal works that help the reader focus on overcoming various forms of mental illness. So we're going to be talking to him about mental illness and why he decided to create this book series and what it's all about. So Brian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Curtis.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Happy to do that. Brian Sachetta, author, blogger, software developer from Boston, Massachusetts. I run a website / book series / brand called Get Out of Your Head. As you mentioned, Curtis, that's a mental health brand. So the mission, goal, purpose of the brand is to help folks who are battling mental illnesses such as anxiety and depression. The brand itself kind of came out of, was the result of, me struggling with some of my own mental battles, anxiety, depression, that sort of thing. So, wanted to take some of my experiences and the things that I learned along the way and provide those to readers and listeners in hopes of helping them through some of the difficulties that they are going through in their own lives.
Well, I know lots of people go through mental illness, but what made you want to say, hey, I want to write about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of those things where, sometimes I say on podcasts like this one is that it was a little bit of like an irrational sense of confidence, if that makes any sense. It was like I had made a lot of progress with my own anxiety. And I kind of realized that, I really started battling anxiety or it came to the forefront in 2008. And then by the time 2015 rolled around, which was obviously a good amount of time, 7 years there, I had made a lot of progress with the condition. And I was both excited and relieved, and also had just sort of, as I mentioned, like an irrational sense of confidence where I felt as though I actually could help people. And I wanted to teach some of the things that I learned and share some of my insights and experiences with other people. I guess what's funny for me looking back now, right, is like, I think, when we're young or younger, sometimes we can overestimate how our own skills or something like that. And I think along the journey now, I feel as though, if I look back, I'm like in 2015, in some way, I felt as though I had it, quote unquote, all figured out. And I think as I've gotten older and gone through, some more battles of my own, I think you realize that maybe nobody has it all figured out, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you can't share some of the progress that you have made with other folks. So I look back on it a little bit and I'm humbled a little bit, if that makes sense, from the standpoint of when I said, hey, maybe I have all this stuff figured out. And then a few years later, fell into a depressive episode, sort of a battle with a disease that I thought that I had maybe gotten past. It humbles you, right? It says, okay, maybe you don't know everything, and maybe let's approach this stuff in a slightly more guarded fashion. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that, I guess, even having said the fact that I have struggled with these things over the course of time, I don't think that takes away from the ability to share what I have learned with other folks, right? We are all works in progress. We are all, we all have our own struggles and battles and that sort of thing. And so it's the continual learning mindset and the things that I integrate into my own life and experiences that I continue to try to share with other folks.
If you could give the listeners one strategy to be able to deal with anxiety, what would that strategy be? Your best strategy?
Yeah. So why don't I answer it slightly differently? I will give strategies, but I think there's a high level one and then there's a low level one. So the high level is if we approach anxiety from the standpoint of, anxiety is basically future oriented fear. So, let's step back and what does that mean? It's basically fear is I am, walking in the woods and there's a bear across my path right now. And I need to figure out how to get away from that bear. Anxiety is future oriented fear. So it's I'm afraid of maybe being in front of a bear in a few weeks. or tomorrow or something like that. And so it's almost as if like, and there are different ways that anxiety can come about, right? Like our bodies could react to something. We could be ruminating, overthinking about a certain subject or something like that. But I think one of the most common ways that we get into anxiety or we experience anxiety is through overthinking. So the ethos of my brand, right? This high level strategy, when I say get out of your head, what I'm trying to say is the cycles in your mind, the ones where you're over worrying, overthinking, those thought patterns tend to make you fearful, right? And then those lead to some of the bodily experiences that we associate with anxiety. So a fast heartbeat, sweaty palms, something like that. When I say get out of your head, and why that is the ethos of my brand is I'm saying, look, I'm not a doctor, right? So I can't diagnose, I can't treat, I can't provide medication to somebody, but what I can do is I can focus on, the parts of the anxiety equation that we can control or influence. And one of the biggest pieces of that is our thinking. So the high level strategy is like the idea that, constantly chewing over something is especially something that makes us fearful in the first place, is never going to help us alleviate our anxiety. I think Einstein said something like, you can't solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. That's the notion there, right? Is like, if, some level kind of thinking made you anxious in the first place, that same style of thinking is not going to then carry you away from the fear. So that's the high level strategy, is figure out a way to distract yourself, to get yourself out of your mind and to get out of your head. If I were to answer the actual question that you asked, which is like, what is the best strategy? I guess another sort of like multi-pronged answer is one, I think that the challenge of answering that question is that different things work better for different folks, right? So I could say this is the best strategy we have, but that might not work for everyone. And so that's why in my first book, which is, Get Out of Your Head, Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety, I throw a lot of different strategies at the reader in hopes of allowing them to build their own quote unquote anxiety toolkit or mental health toolkit, a bunch of different strategies that they can pull out when they're fearful to help walk some of that fear back. For me to finally answer the actual question, what I find is really helpful is box breathing. So box breathing is a specific kind of breathing. It's really just breathing with a pattern associated with it. So for some folks, it may be like, the pattern may be breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds. There is some science behind breathing and, getting into a calm state. It has to do with the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight system, and, what we call either the parasympathetic nervous system or the feed and breathe or rest and digest system. And so when we're breathing out deeply, we're activating the calming parts of our nervous systems. Also allows us to, the breathing itself, when we have some sort of pattern associated with it, if we're able to say, okay, in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, it gives us somewhere else to place our focus other than the things that are scaring us. So it's a very simple concept. Obviously, it's not something that's, earth shattering or mind blowing or something like that. But at the same time, I think, I have used, some sort of box breathing throughout anxiety provoking situations in my own life. And I think when other folks do as well, even though it's not rocket science, I think that they can find that it is pretty helpful.
Well, let's talk about some tips for listeners to be able to deal with and try to overcome depression.
Yeah. So, depression, I think what I like to say, right, is, I've written 2 books so far. The first one that we talked about already is on anxiety. The second one is on depression. What I like to say is both conditions are very, very challenging, right? Scary, make us feel really lousy. I think one of the things that maybe, and it varies for each person, at least what I have found with myself is that I have an easier time getting out of an anxious state than a depressed one. I feel as though depression sometimes can be more pervasive. It can kind of creep into every level of our lives or at the very least push us down strongly enough that, we don't necessarily feel as though we want to take action to try to improve our lots in life or, change our state, make ourselves feel a little bit better. I will say that just because I find depression to get out of harder than anxiety, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't get out of it. And there are a lot of different strategies that we could put forth to talk about in order to, get past depression or manage depression. I think one that I like to talk about quite a bit is, just physical activity, exercising. There's a lot of research studies that have been done over time that show that, adhering to a physical activity plan, some sort of exercise plan can be, and not always, but, can be as helpful in the treatment of depression as psychiatric medication. And, that's not to say, if you're listening, that is not to say that, because, one strategy, exercise and medicine, because, one of them is more powerful or equally powerful than the other. It's not to say that like you should go and drop your medication. I am absolutely not saying that. I think if anything, right, it's like we want to try to heal ourselves or get past our depression as quickly as we can. And so in spirit of that, I think we want to, with the recommendations of our doctors and the right people, we want to try out as many healing modalities as we can get our hands on, and then see which ones work for us and leverage those ones in order, to get past our dark states a little bit more quickly. So for me, I try to exercise about 5 times a week. I find as though, getting my body really moving can help me get out of my head, get back into my physiology, and help me kind of take my mind off of some of the things that I'm dealing with. I find, again, a simple activity or a simple strategy, but exercise really can be effective in the treatment of depression or just battling depression in general. And some of the studies back that up. So it's an important one, even if it is, again, not necessarily rocket science.
Besides overthinking, what are some of the common reasons that people experience anxiety as well as depression?
Yeah. So there are many different factors. And I guess let me kind of step back and talk about my second book. So the second book I wanted to write from a holistic standpoint, right? Basically saying that depression can manifest itself in many different ways or as a result of many different factors. So I took a look at this model that was put forth by a couple scientists in the 1970s called the biopsychosocial model, which basically seeks to say, a disease that, especially a mental illness that we deal with, is going to be the result of the biological, the psychological, and the social aspects of our lives, right? So if we look at depression and we say, what does that mean in terms of the model that Brian just talked about? Biological would be, your body itself, right? Do you have a brain that is predisposed to certain neurotransmitter activity that causes depression or leads to depression more often? Psychological would be your thoughts and beliefs, right? So that was kind of Curtis, when you said, how else can we, experience anxiety or depression other than overthinking? That overthinking, encompasses the psychological piece here. So that's kind of an overlap or a repeat of what we've already said. And then the social aspect is kind of everything else in our lives, right? So, if somebody were to lose somebody very special to them, that could be a way that they fall into depression. If somebody were to lose their job, or, realize that they don't have a lot of close friends with whom they can share, their deepest opinions, emotions, feelings, that sort of stuff, then it's very easy, or it becomes easy, or at the very least becomes quite possible for us to experience some form of despair. So I think it's important to look at both anxiety and depression from a holistic standpoint, in the sense that, there's not just one entry path into each disease. There are several. And I think on the anxiety side, right? So even though we can sometimes overthink, we can put ourselves into anxiety via our thinking, our cognition. There is also, right, that biological side, in the sense that maybe our brains from the get-go, like maybe we have genetics that predispose us to feeling anxious in general, or, the way that our brains were constructed, or, the way the genes came together, our brains, we may have overactive amygdala. Those are the fear centers of the brain. So in that sense, right, it could be that like we don't necessarily overthink all that often, but maybe our internal alarm systems are quick to go off, right? Maybe as soon as we see something outside that's not actually that threatening, our bodies just send us into a revved up state. And then from there, it's easy for us to fall into anxiety. So there are a lot of different paths into both diseases. And I think that talking about both of them from that holistic standpoint allows us to explore those things a little bit more.
For somebody out there who might be experiencing anxiety or depression right now, what tips or advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to tell that person is that, they are not alone. Or if you're listening now, you are not alone. There are lots of folks out there who are going through the same things that you are going through. And that is not to say, like, I don't say that to say like, hey, you're not special. It's to try to help you maybe see some solidarity in the struggle, right? To say, hey, I'm right there with you. I've been through anxiety. I've been through depression. Right now, I'm not anxious. Right now, I'm not depressed, but I can almost guarantee you I will experience those things again in the future. So it's sort of like, reaching out and kind of finding shared humanity aspect or something like that. I think also just to remember that, your fears are not always accurate. And most of the time they aren't accurate, right? It's like some people say when you doubt your beliefs, I'm trying to remember the exact line. It's like, doubt your beliefs and believe your doubts, I think is what it is. You can get yourself into a really difficult or dark place. And so, our minds aren't always our friends in the sense that they sometimes get us to believe those doubts, right? And I think being able to sometimes get out of our heads to step back and get perspective allows us to sometimes say, hey, maybe those things that I'm chewing over either aren't as important as maybe the weight that I'm assigning to them right now, or maybe they're not accurate, right? Maybe I got too close to the problem and I'm seeing it in a specific kind of way that isn't helpful. So, it's difficult because it's right. It's hard for me to say to a specific person, like, hey, you're dealing with depression. It'll be over next week. Like I can't do that. I can't know that for sure. And I also can't make, false promises. But what I can say is that I know that in time, things will get better. And it's important to hold on to that idea because, if you look at some of the scientific definitions of depression, right? Like people sometimes equate depression with learned helplessness or hopelessness. And I think that if you lose hope, it's very easy to fall into depression or to continue on in a depressive state. So it's important to, remain optimistic to the degree that you can, even if that just means like, hey, one day it will get better. I'm not entirely sure how. And I guess just, like from somebody like myself who has experienced these things before, I'm not going to sugarcoat things and say, again, they'll get better next week. But, people have, I guess, like myself, people have been through some pretty rough patches. And I think that in life, there are different seasons, right? It's like sometimes it's winter, sometimes it's summer. That doesn't, that's not to downplay anything that somebody's going through, but just to remember to hold on to the hope that, summer will return because eventually it will. And I guess, holding on to some of the strategies that we talk about in this podcast to do our best to try to apply them when it makes sense. Obviously, not every day it's going to make sense or it's going to feel right to do so. There are definitely times where it's hard, right? It's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to, maintain a certain style of thinking. But the more we do that and the more we, keep putting one foot in front of the other, I think the closer that we get to hopefully the end that is almost in sight.
Tell us the story behind your brand, because I noticed that your brand looks a little different than other brands in the space. So kind of give us the background of why that is.
Yeah. So if you were to look at my website and the brand itself, so it's portrayed pretty well on the first book cover. So this is the word mark itself. If anybody is on the video feed, which is just, basic, get out of your head. And then the icon of the brand or the logo of the brand is basically what I call a snake brain. So it's like a snake figure, and then its head is a brain. And so it's a little different from, many or several mental health brands in the sense that, there aren't, in the color scheme, in the design itself, in the logo, there are no rainbows, no unicorns, sunshine, anything like that. It's a little darker intentionally because I think that one of the shortcomings of a mental health brand that solely focuses on, the positive is the fact that this, anxiety, depression, dealing with mental illness is a tough and sometimes long road. And I want to give the importance that thing deserves, right? Or the notion that this battle is difficult. I want to symbolize that in my brand. And that's what we've done. There's a lot of different emotions and sort of like ideas that we're evoking with the brand. So the reason, one reason why, there's a snake in the branding is like, you could think of the mind as if it were a serpent or a snake and how it coils around its prey, right? In the sense that if we take that idea, that analogy and apply it, to our brains or to our psyches, our minds can sometimes coil around us and make us feel as though, we are trapped. We are in hopeless situations or something like that. And then I guess, one other, like kind of the other side of that coin is the idea that serpents can be tamed, right? The mind can be tamed a little bit. So being able to apply some of the strategies that I talk about in my books and podcasts and blogs and stuff like that, that can help us do that taming. So I think all of those things were important. I wanted to convey, those different ideas and emotions. And then lastly, there is an element of there in there that is sort of meant to be a little bit inspirational or aspirational. I listen to a lot of heavy metal. And so when me and my designer sat down to create this brand, we came up with all different ideas and thoughts. And I guess designers would call it like a mood board or something, where it's, they'll have you go online, take pictures of different brands and just photos and whatnot, things that you like. And then you're sort of creating these different associations and trying to group things into buckets and say, hey, this is the overall tone theme that we want to strike. And as we, went through that exercise, we kept coming back to the notion of like heavy metal or some sort of like punk rock music or something like that. And I think that, one of the elements of, music, heavy music in general, hardcore, something like that, is this sort of determination or, motivation, right? Where it's like, I wanted to create a logo that wasn't like, my logo is not meant to be terrifying. It's meant to do all the things that, or evoke all the emotions that we've already talked about thus far, but also get you a little bit excited, get you a little amped up, right? So when you see this snake that's snarling at you, it's meant to have you look at it and say like, come on, like, let's go a little bit. Right. And again, I don't like to sell false bills of goods or anything like that. It's not meant to say like, hey, if you get inspired, you can just overcome anything. Again, this is a difficult journey, but we put all those messages together, and that's the brand that we get for Get Out of Your Head. A lot of different emotions and stories in that one.
Talk about one of the most profound experiences you've had with mental illness and how has it made its way into your writing? Yeah.
So one story that I come back to quite a bit, and it's actually the very first story in my first book. So I had just gone off to college. This was 2008. A couple weeks into my experience at Boston College, I had met this girl that I liked. We hung out a couple times, seemed as though we liked each other, that sort of thing. And a couple days later, or, at the end of those couple of weeks or whatever, she texted me and basically, I think it was a Friday night. And she said that she was coming over, and I was like, I'm excited because I like this girl, but I'm also terrified because, I had a panic attack in front of a woman that I liked that I was on a date with a few months before that. And so that was kind of where my mind continued to go in my intimate relationships. And I always I knew that drinking helped me evade some of the overthinking and the anxiety. And on this particular night, I had not been drinking. So I could, via her text messages and just the tone and the words that came through, it was very easy to see that she had been drinking. And so I guess I was just like, I was nervous, not only because of this situation where I liked this person and I didn't know how things would transpire or anything like that, but also knowing that like she was intoxicated and seems as though she was a little aggressive or whatever, right? Like via her text messages, like just maybe slightly out of control or something like that. I was very nervous. So she comes over and I'm trying to prevent myself from falling into another panic attack like the one that I had a few months prior. And as soon as she sat down next to me, she could feel that my heart was racing. I don't know if she could tell that my palms were sweating or anything like that, or that I could barely focus and see, but I was definitely having a hard time. And as soon as she sat down, she could feel my heart racing. And she got up and she was bewildered, and she was like, oh my God, you're shaking. Like, what the heck is going on? Like, you're a freak, whatever. Runs down the hall, runs back to her dorm. And that was the end of that night, which was very humiliating, definitely embarrassing. Woke up the next day and was kind of like, okay, this is two of those experiences in the last 6 or so months. I really need to, figure something out for myself. I need to, I guess, begin this journey and figure out what it is that I'm dealing with. And then from there, find a way to get past it or manage it. At that time, I didn't know a lot about anxiety. I knew that I got nervous, and that's basically what I would say to myself, or what I would call it. So from there, it was really a process of, diving on in and getting into the journey, listening to audiobooks, reading some books on the subject, picking up a lot of the research, and, going to a therapist and whatnot, and just trying to manage, or I guess, I think I said it already, but figure out what it was that I was dealing with. And then from there, kind of navigate the journey. How that comes into my writing is, I think I mentioned it already, but that's the very first story that I tell in my first book. And it kind of sets the scene, right? It's like, it's me jumping into that journey, kind of taking the reader on an adventure to say like, hey, I've been here before as well. I'm not trying to compare my experiences with their experiences and say that what I've gone through is more difficult than what they have or anything like that. But it's just to say like, hey, here's an instance of anxiety that I've dealt with before. And now the rest of the book, we're going to try to, I guess, distill down some of the experiences that I've been through, including, the one with the female in college, and try to take some positive things away from them, whether those are perspectives, insights, strategies. So that was a foundational element of my first book.
Do you have any current or upcoming projects that you're working on that people need to know about?
Yeah. So right now, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I would say so my second book came out in November of 2021 last year. And then this year has been mostly focused around podcast appearances, getting blog posts out there, trying to engage my audience, right, with my email newsletter and whatnot. I am doing a slight update to my first book at the moment, just some small editorial stuff. And surprisingly, all that takes up a decent amount of time. I would say the other thing that takes up a lot of time is the fact that I am not, I'm not doing this writing stuff full time. I have a full-time job as a software developer, which is great. And it's a meaningful and fun job, but at the same time, it only leaves so many hours left in all the other days or in every day for me to be able to focus to get out of your head brand. So I would say in time, I would love to write a third book. I have loose plans to do that, but it's that sort of thing is a massive undertaking. So right now I'm kind of treading cautiously there. Just, to commit to that it's expensive from a time perspective. So just kind of, figuring it out from there. In time, I would like to start my own podcast. But again, another one of those time commitment things where it's like, I just got to figure out what the right balance is. So I don't have a great answer here. It's more just kind of plugging away, trying to, continue to deliver content to my listeners and to my readers, because obviously, well, for me, I can't write a book every 6 months. And right now I can't even do it every year, but I want to be able to continue to deliver value to folks, even though the schedule doesn't necessarily permit for book 3 or book 4 or something like that.
Well, so people can check out what you do have, throw out your website information and any social media links that you might have.
Cool. Yeah. So my website is getoutofyourhead.com. No dashes, no spaces in that. It's all one word. The social media platform that you'll find me active on today, and it is July of 2022. That would be Instagram. So the handle there is Get Out of Your Head. No spaces, no dashes on that either. I would say I've got some loose plan. Again, a lot of plans, not necessarily anything concrete just yet. But, in the future, I would love to start my own podcast and then chop up some of the episodes and get them onto TikTok and whatnot. But for the moment, I am not on TikTok. Just got to be methodical with where I put my time. So yeah, getoutofyourhead.com, and then Instagram, Get Out of Your Head. Please feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about something, if you want to share something with me. My DMs are always open. It's definitely not meant to be one of those like, hey, this is this expert in his ivory tower. One of the things I love most about the author journey, my journey, has been connecting with readers and listeners and hearing some of the stories and experiences and, I guess, overcomings of hardships that listeners and readers have been, kind enough to share with me. So please reach out if you feel that you want to.
All right. Close us out with any final thoughts, maybe some stuff that you would like to touch on that we haven't talked about, or just any final thoughts you got for the listeners?
Yeah, just reiterating that the notion, right, that, whatever it is that you're going through, anxiety, depression, PTSD, something like that, know that you're not alone. Know that others are battling the same things right alongside you, and that, there are people that are willing to listen, right? It's like someone like myself, a loved one. Please reach out and get help if you feel as though you need it. If you feel as though you can't talk to anybody, you could try to find a doctor or a therapist, and you could also reach out to me. I would reiterate that I am not one of those things. I'm not, a trained clinician, but I'm just somebody who cares a lot and wants to help. So yeah, please reach out to me if you feel as though, you have something that you want to get off your chest or communicate with me. And lastly, just, hold on to the hope that things could get better, because whatever it is that you're going through, it will inevitably pass. It might not be tomorrow. It might not be a month from now, but in time, it will pass. And I guess, just holding on to the notion that it will, sometimes that helps get us through. So, I commend everybody for, being out there, being in the battle. It's definitely not easy. It's very hard at times, but I think there's a lot of brave folks out there, especially folks that are listening, and hats off to them. So,
ladies and gentlemen, getoutayourhead.com. If you know of anybody going through a hard time, please be sure to follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. You can now also check out the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast on the Podbreed Network. You can download the Podbreed app on Apple or Google Play and check out my show as well as all of the other wonderful shows on the network. Brian, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Curtis.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.